Welcome to the History Nerd 9 podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, Samuel Marquis, Captain Kidd, he's related to him. That's right. I basically got you a pirate for this episode. He's not a pirate. Maybe actually I believe his ninth great-grandfather, who is William Kidd, wasn't quite a pirate either. That's the point of the book, is that Captain Kidd got hosed. He's not the bad guy that everybody says he is, and Samuel is here to set the record straight. So let's do this. Let's get him on. And here we are with author Samuel Marquis, Captain Kidd, A True Story of Treasure and Betrayal. Samuel, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. Good to be here.
We got to set this up right away, and just bear with me for a second. You are the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Captain William Kidd?
Yes, and that's the same as ninth great-grandson.
Okay, yeah, we're going to do that. I was only doing all of those just the first time.
I like how you did it, though. You can understand how long ago it was.
Now, I need to say this, right? Like, we're going to talk about how, no other way to say it, Captain Kidd got screwed. All right, so that part we're still angry about. I'm with you. However, it's kind of cool to say one of my ancestors was a pirate, though, right?
Yeah, it's pirate. Let's keep the quotation marks around pirate. But yes, he was a licensed privateer who got involved in a tough situation in the Indian Ocean. Let's just say that.
Do you think anything was passed down to you as far as not following rules? And bear in mind, I have read your bio, so you can't lie to me. Were you maybe a little bit of a hellion when you were growing up?
Yes, I was a troublemaker, but I always had a conscience. So yes, I grew up in Denver. We threw snowballs at cars. We bumper hitched. I mean, at a Bronco game one time when I was a kid, Denver Bronco game in the 70s, I was there with a bunch of old men throwing snowballs at Chiefs fans. I was like 10 years old, and I'm talking about 100 people whipping snowballs hard. So yes, I was a little bit of a hellion growing up.
So you hated Chiefs fans before it was cool, which is recently, is what you're telling me.
Long before. Raiders, though, were the most hated when I was a kid.
That makes sense.
Yes.
And here's another thing, too. You've written a lot of fiction, right? But this is pure history. What made you decide that this was going to be pure history, right? Because I know for a lot of people, historical fiction, that's your thing. You would go right to it. And especially with pirates, history can be a bit spotty with the records. Why did you decide to make this one nonfiction?
Well, I'll make this short, but I started out writing environmental thrillers because I'm still a practicing hydrogeologist. So I'm a vice president, principal hydrogeologist with an environmental firm in Boulder, Colorado. So my first two books, I wrote what I knew. I had a Native American lacrosse playing geologist who's, more or less kind of was me, but Native American, full-blooded Cheyenne, Northern Cheyenne Indian, because I have my family connection. Thomas B. Marquis is connected. He's buried at the Little Bighorn, but he didn't fight there. He was an Indian rights activist and translator who took all the Cheyenne testimony at the Little Bighorn, but he was buried 50 years after Custer at the Little Bighorn in the 1930s. So the irony is I've grown up with all this Native American, culture from Thomas B. Marquis, who took all the Cheyenne testimony at the Little Bighorn comes from him. He spoke Indian Sign Language with the Northern Cheyenne warriors and Lakota too, enough to get by. And so I started out with those thrillers, and then I gradually evolved into heavily factual historical fiction. To be honest, my last 5 books are really the same as narrative nonfiction. They're so, unless it's Patton with one of his aides, so I'm showing a softer side to him, it's all exactly from the journals and the battlefield reports, and everything's very factual. So really, I've been factual with my last 5 books before this. And the thing is, I started this book as historical fiction. I got halfway through it and I said, what am I doing? I need to write the definitive Captain Kidd book. So I stopped and I went back and I had to redo everything up to that point. Although the battle scenes were pretty similar. They're not, that you have some, dramatic flourishes in between actual known events. And, everything that's happening is recorded, but you still have to interpret things a little bit, and even nonfiction. So it was an easy transition for me. It was a natural, logical transition.
Now let's set the stage for it too, because a big thing that comes out of this is a difference between a privateer and a pirate. Now, for people like me, like we know the difference because we've read plenty of pirate books. But for somebody who doesn't know, what's the difference between a privateer and a pirate?
It's complicated, but I'm going to try and make it very simple. The point is modern day historians and writers tend to act like there was a big difference back then. There was, as I say in my book, over and over again, because I hammer it and I want to get it right, there was virtually no difference between pirates, privateers, Royal Navy men, and wreckers, who were guys who dove around treasure, because treasure ships are crashing all the time. And even just rich, wealthy merchant ships were crashing all over the Caribbean, all up the Florida coast, everywhere. So there were wreckers who were full-time salvage guys who were hunting down treasure. Well, they were always a little roguish. Even the Royal Navy guys, Royal Navy was committing piracy all the time. They would go up to people and wrongfully search their vessels and take stuff from them all the time. So the difference between, Royal Navy, pirates, privateers who were licensed commerce raiders fighting on behalf of the state, given, whether it was England, France, Portugal, Spain, or the Dutch, who were kind of the most powerful seafaring empires then. And so they were licensed, but sometimes they would cross the line or the war would end and they wouldn't know about it. And so, as you said earlier, someone like Sir Francis Drake, on the one hand, the Spanish called him a pirate, okay? But he was only sticking it to Spain and was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I in the late 1500s when he returned home. So there's a fine line between it, and there wasn't that much difference back then. And modern scholars and writers tend to think there was a bigger difference than there was.
And now, what was Kidd's background? Did he start as, what do they call him, a swabby or something? How does he end up? Is he ever in the Royal Navy? Is he a merchantman? Before we get to the big Indian Ocean voyage of his, what was his background before this all happens?
Well, he was born in England, but really spent most of his early years in Scotland and around the Dundee area. And we don't know precisely. Most people kind of conclude that he was a cabin boy at a reasonably young age and went to the Caribbean because, he became a pretty solid seaman. So he was educated in mathematics and navigation. He came from a Protestant Christian family, in England and Scotland. It was connected to Scotland too. And so he came over at an early age to the Caribbean, probably starting out in the merchant world, and then he became eventually a buccaneer. And buccaneers, of course, weren't pirates. They were licensed privateers, but they were roguish, let's admit it. But they were sticking it to Imperial Spain, usually with licenses, but some of them were flimsy. So some of them crossed the line, others didn't cross the line nearly as much. So like Sir Henry Morgan, the most famous buccaneer of all time, did get in trouble, but he was eventually knighted. And, even when he was in the Tower of London, he was apparently going out to the bars all the time with like the wealthy aristocrats of London. So it's like one man's pirate is another man's privateer, is kind of the rule of the day. Captain Kidd, though, was very stickler about sticking to his licenses. So in 1690, his crew wanted him to turn pirate. He staunchly refused, and they stole his ship and took off with it. And there are guys that he later in the book, as you know, because you read it, are guys who made his life miserable down the road. His original crew that mutinied. They mutinied and stole his ship and all of his money, 2,000 pounds worth, which back then was worth like $750,000. So Captain Kidd was wealthy. He had properties in New York. Unlike most of his peers, he didn't piss away his fortune on women and liquor. He actually bought smart enough to buy New York real estate that would be worth literally like $500 million today or more. His properties, if he had like 4 or 5 of them. And when he married Sarah Bradley Cox Ert, who had multiple marriages, his long-term love, they joined their forces, and they were some of the richest people in Manhattan.
And here's another thing, too, and I want the listeners to understand this. You did not jump ahead with that whole mutiny thing. this is before we get into everything else. Like, this is a long career with a lot of weird stuff happening and enemies left and right. Not necessarily. He's, as you're talking about, all of this stuff happens. He's back in New York, though. He's still making it happen. He is, in effect, turned himself into a gentleman, right, with a solid marriage. I mean, that's something you harp on and make sure they know that this is not a guy who's got a woman in every port. He's fallen in love, and he's trying to make it as a gentleman about town, not, a buccaneer who's leaving every 3 weeks.
And like I said, he came from a common family, but they were, he was educated. He was, he could read title charts. He knew how to navigate. You can't become a captain and not know a lot. They were very forceful. They were very powerful back then. Sea captains were a kind of elite, colonial elite, really, just a notch below the leading merchants because they were so skilled at what they did, and everything revolved around maritime trade and maritime fighting, empires fighting constantly. So Captain Kidd was a true gentleman. There's tons of actions. Tons of people say what a gentleman he was. He was the trusty and well-beloved Captain Kidd of the King of England. George Washington never was the trusty and well-beloved of George Washington when he fought in the French and Indian War in the 1760s. He wanted to be badly accepted by England. He never was. Captain Kidd was. He was, the trusty and well-beloved of the King of England. How big is that? Back then, for a common-born Englishman who immigrated and really became a colonial American. He embraced the American culture in New York, and he became a man of affairs, but he was always a little bit principled. See, I call him the Buccaneer Boy Scout, because of that. Because, he had his wild side. He definitely liked to hang out with the wild guys, kind of like JFK hanging out with Sinatra or something, People always like to hang out with rogues, they're a little bit intrigued by him. So he definitely hung out with them. He was a little roguish. I'm sure he had his wild years in Port Royal, the wickedest city on earth, in Jamaica, in the 1670s and 80s primarily. So he was not a saint, but he was a good guy. Let's just be honest.
Well, and this is the thing. He's settled in. He's got a wife. He's got property, everything that we're talking about. But he goes out on this fateful voyage to the Indian Ocean all around the world. Why does he end up going out on this voyage? Was it his idea? Was he jonesing to get back out there? How does he end up doing this?
Well, it's a long thing, so I'm going to make it quick here. I'm going to do the quickie version. In June of 1695, he sailed to London with his brother-in-law, Samuel Bradley, Sarah's younger brother. And he took a load of, a huge cargo of cloth and some other New York products. But he wanted to get a privateering commission from the crown because he was getting older, kind of probably a little bit of a midlife crisis kind of situation because he was in his, by then he was in his early 40s, which was much older. That'd be like early 60s now, really. Let's be honest.
I'm 43 and I'm feeling it right now, Samuel.
Okay. It was something a lot of people. But so he went there partly because the Red Sea trade was exploding in New York, Newport, Boston, Philadelphia, and all of these. For ships were going from colonial America to the Indian Ocean and stealing from the Great Mughal of India, just robbing treasure ships that were worth between $20 million and $200 million today. And the crew would come back, little farm boys to skilled seamen would become millionaires overnight. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, actually, in the 1690s. Well, Captain Kidd, by 1694, Thomas II was the most famous. He was a Rhode Island privateer. He was a gentleman. He just made a killing and came back, and then he went out again on a second voyage, which was kind of a mistake. Captain Kidd, when he went to London, was recruited for this pirate hunting mission to the Indian Ocean to hunt down the Red Sea men, including Thomas II, the Rhode Island gentleman pirate that he may have known, as I indicate in my book. And so, but what happened is he didn't want to do it. He was like, I don't want to go hunt pirates. I want to be a privateer fighting the French. He wanted to be more naval-oriented than pirate hunter. But Lord Belmont, who would soon become the governor of New York, Massachusetts Bay, and New Hampshire, threatened him and coerced him into doing it. So him and Robert Livingston, who was a Scotsman, New Yorker, pretty much, convinced him, mostly Lord Belmont, let's put the blame where it belongs, pretty much coerced and threatened to take his ship, impress all of his seamen if he didn't agree to the pirate hunting voyage to the Indian Ocean that would make Captain Kidd the most famous pirate of all time, along with Blackbeard. Let's just say they co-own it. He didn't want to do it. And a lot of authors and even some scholars, shockingly, don't even make that clear. That's one thing I make it clear. Believe me, I go back to it. He didn't want to go. He didn't want him to go hunt pirates. I mean, that's a thankless job and pretty threatening. So he returned to New York, and then he set sail. He finally just said, well, I got to make this work. Went back to New York because he had to round out his crew because the war with King William's War between England and France, there was a manpower shortage in the Royal Navy. So he was only allowed like 70 seamen. So he had to go to New York to get up to 150. So he spent 2 months there, and then he set sail for the Indian Ocean on September 6th of 1696 to hunt down the Red Sea men, and specifically Thomas Tew.
Now, and this is something, too, I don't want to miss this from what you said. This is a clash of classes, basically, at this point, which is you have these older gentlemen who have their names, and they're the blue bloods. And this is Kidd, who's kind of new money, a new gentleman, doesn't have that background. And as you were saying, he's strong-armed into this. There's multiple times where he's kind of like, how do I get out of this? But because of these big names that were forcing him out there, there wasn't a way out, really.
Well, hindsight's 20/20, because everyone's like, why did he go on that crazy voyage? Why did he agree to go to the Indian Ocean, hunt down pirates? He didn't want to do it. But you're right. Back then, class hierarchy, especially in England, the most class-conscious empire under the sun, according to George Orwell, he basically, he didn't want to do it, but they were too powerful. So the Duke of Shrewsbury, Admiral Russell, Lord Belmont was the worst one. All of them, and mostly Lord Belmont, kind of roped him into this thing. And he's like, well, I'll make it work. If I can take 2 pirate ships shortly after they've hunted down treasure, I have a legal license to do it. And I'm going to be loaded for life, because his cut would have made him, he would have been a little bit like Thomas Tew. He would have gotten, they had to give a cut away to the principals, but he would have for sure made at least 3 or 4 million in today's dollars.
And now we've talked about privateering, but I don't think a lot of people realize how obnoxiously annoying being a privateer could be, because you have boats that will use fake flags or won't fly flags. And basically, if you're going to stick to the rules like Kidd would, because as you said, Boy Scout of pirates, air quotes, he sees a boat, oh, it's flying a French flag. Great, I can go take that boat because I have a license for this. Then you got to flag down the boat. If you don't have to battle it, you can get onto the boat, but you might get on there and get their papers and be like, oh, you're English, you were flying a French flag. I've just wasted a lot of time, right?
Yes. The way that it worked back then is even the Royal Navies flew false flags all the time, or no flag at all, because they wanted to approach a ship and find out what it was. So it was a constant dog sniffing contest in the 1600s, 1700s to figure out what they really were. And the only thing that mattered in that time is what papers they formally handed over. The flag didn't matter. The captain didn't matter what country he was from, because captains flew for other countries all the time. The only thing that matters is what papers you handed over. So if you handed over French papers, you were a French ship. If you handed over Portuguese papers, you were a Portuguese ship, regardless of the flag you might have flown during the chase. So Captain Kidd hunted down tons of vessels that he never took anything from, because he let them go repeatedly during his Indian Ocean voyage and before then, because he would stick to his license. Am I at war with that country right now? And if so, if they presented papers from that country, he had a lawful right to take that ship and its captain and to imprison all of the crew and the captain and bring them as war prisoners.
And then you got 2 other things is maybe you don't know that the war ended because you're in the middle of the Indian Ocean, so maybe you don't find out. And then also on top of that, speaking of Royal Navy ships, they might just take your crew right? If they flag you down, they might say, "Oh, well, we're the Royal Navy, so we need a couple of sailors. So sucks to be you."
A couple. Usually they took a lot more than that. Captain Kidd, as you know, because you read the book, which I thank you for, Brendan. In the Indian Ocean, Commodore Thomas Warren tried to steal 40 of his guys. And you can call it impressment and say it was legal, but it was just like pirating. It was the same as pirates. Let's not let the Royal Navy, just because they're a state, just because they're state sanctioned doesn't give them the right to necessarily go take 40 guys and cripple Kidd's voyage. So he escaped during the night because he was with the Commodore Warren for a week, being wined and dined by this Royal Navy guy. And at night, one night, what Commodore Warren said, well, I'm going to need to take, 30 or 40 of your guys. Captain Kidd's like, no problem. And then he snuck away during the night. That was the beginning of him being called a pirate, just because he was trying to escape the Royal Navy. I mean, come on. So he was trying to protect his crew, really. So, yes, it happened all the time. The Royal Navy did have a legal right to, I'll give them that, did a legal right to, take sailors because it was wartime against France. So they had the right to take it from merchantmen and privateers as the Royal Navy. But it was kind of a nasty thing to do. They didn't just take a couple guys. They wanted 40 or so.
Now, there is a major event where we're going to get to the actual did he or did he not become a pirate event in a second. One of the other problems, and we got to kind of lean into this one, is he may have sort of murdered a crewman on his ship. Tell me a little bit about that particular event, because when you talk about Captain Kidd and they're like, is he a pirate or is he not? That event comes up every time you look at this.
Okay, so without giving away too much of the book, I'll tiptoe around it a little bit so that I don't spoil it for readers. But the bottom line is this Indian Ocean voyage from 1696 to 1699 was an epic disaster, okay? It was just as bad as, David Gran wrote this book called The Wager, and it's like, oh my God. These voyages are like the voyage to hell, okay? So he had not only was, Commodore Thomas Warren trying to steal all his crew and take, 30 to 40 crewmen from him, which would have, he wouldn't have been able to fire a proper broadside, from only a handful of his guns if they had taken that many. So he not only had that, but his men did get scurvy because he had to lengthen his voyage a month to get away from Warren. So he did that hurt him. And then like 30 to 40 of his guys died on Mohilia Island, in the, Comoros island chain just west of Madagascar. So he lost like 35 guys to tropical disease because they just died all the time back then. And so luckily he was able to get about, 10 or 15 guys back, from recruiting on the island and people leaving the East India Company ships, because the East India Company ships, those guys were like barbarians. Those guys were cruel, even far crueler than Kidd, who was a privateer who had to get the approval of his crew for most things that he did. So he got other crew members who were jumping ship from nasty East India Company ships. And so then he had fights with the natives. His crew sometimes got attacked when they're trying to get water, and they fought back, and the crew sometimes was out of control when he wasn't keeping an eye on them. So, and then there were tropical storms. He had tropical storms. He had to avoid that. So he was under enemy fire by Moorish ships who were East Indian ships, Portuguese ships. So he had to fight a lot of different people in the Indian Ocean.
Now he gets back, and I'm just going to say this: we don't go too far into it because there's first of all, it's a big part of the back end of the book. But he does get back, and all of a sudden, now he's being branded a pirate. Real quickly, let's not give too much away, but what changes between, hey, William, you're going to do great for us, go on out and do that, and then come back, and now it's like, well, now we have a problem because you're a pirate. What changes?
Yeah, when he came back in 1699 to Antigua, and he found out, there was a crown, basically a wanted poster, type situation, that him and his crew, now by then his other crew had mutinied on St. Mary's Island because Kidd refused to turn to piracy. So his gunner and him, I didn't answer the previous question about the gunner, William Moore, basically Captain Kidd did kill him when William Moore was leading a mutiny on his ship. Over a period of months, it had escalated. The battle between him and his chief gunner, William Moore, who, over his mutinous crew, who was not getting any prize money in the Indian Ocean and was getting frustrated. They finally got into it and came to blows, and Captain Kidd did kill him accidentally. So it would be at the worst case manslaughter. And given that Moore was leading a mutiny, technically back then you wouldn't even be charged for it would definitely not be murder, premeditated murder with wooden bucket. No, that didn't happen. But manslaughter charge would be viable. It would be very barely, because really most captains had pretty wide authority back then. But he lost his control. He lost his temper. He hit William Moore with an empty wooden bucket, and he died the next day of a skull fracture. And, and the Kidd, of course, felt bad for it, but he had been undergoing more tried to steal ships, the smaller ore boats, to go take other ships aboard the Adventure Galley, Captain Kidd's ship. So he had been trying to lead mutinies, and then Kidd finally lost his temper. So in that case, he didn't mean to kill him, but he did. Now, no one knew about that crime and no one cared, but when he went to Antigua in 1699, he was a wanted man, and by then he had about 10 to 15 of his former crew, or 10, and he had hired on 10 or 15 new guys. So he had around 20 to 25 people, but he was accused of piracy then with his crew. So that's when everything changed, and he came back to colonial America, and he was charged as a pirate, and he knew it.
And now, I won't go too far into the trial, but I think we can just say, at the top level, you are not thrilled with how this trial went down, are you? When we're talking about your great ×9 grandpappy.
Yeah. I think this is where everyone in the Captain Kidd story agrees. They agree that the English crown, railroaded him. They took his evidence. Either they withheld it or deliberately hid his French passports that showed that he had taken the Quedagh Merchant, which was worth, probably $60 to $100 million. He had taken it legally because it presented French passes, and he had taken a ship called the Ruthless in the Indian Ocean. So he had taken those ships legally. They had French passes. Those were taken from him before his trial or hidden from him so that he didn't have those. He was also kept under solitary confinement for almost 2 years between once he arrived at Boston all the way until his trial and eventual hanging. And then his lawyers, first of all, they didn't give any money for his lawyers till the night before the trial. So the crown withheld his money. He did get 2 really good lawyers. He got the best pirate trial lawyer in England. But then they went missing after the first trial on the first day. They're gone. We don't know if the crown forced them to leave or if it was the Whig junto, because the Whig junto was the Lord Belmont and the other Whig lords who had sponsored his expedition in the first place. So we don't know, but the crown was up to a lot of dirty tricks to win the trial, because the reason is they didn't catch Henry Avery, who was kind of the worst of the Red Sea pirates, who got away with it all, was never captured. And so Captain Kidd for the crimes of Thomas Tew and Henry Avery, and because he turned himself in, was the one thing he shouldn't have done. Should have never trusted Lord Belmont. So he had to go to trial in England, and they took all his evidence, took his lawyers away from him, and did everything to make sure that he lost. But he still defended himself in court as his own lawyer, basically, and he put up a spirited fight, but it was stacked against him too heavily.
Now, I'm almost 100% sure I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Samuel, I'm going to send you back in time. You get to punch one person from this book. Who are you going to punch?
Who am I going to punch?
Yes.
Or who do I want to hear? Who do I want to hear their testimony about the real Captain Kidd?
Well, that's the next question. You're getting ahead.
Oh, that's the next.
I want to know who you're punching first.
Who do I want to punch? I don't know. Probably Lord Belmont.
I know it.
I would just I would take him out. It would be a bloodbath.
Yeah, I figured that comes through with a lot of other things. That comes through. So the next question, though, if I can send you back and you can get an hour with somebody, I'm taking away William Kidd. That answer's too easy. One person that you can get an hour with, they have to tell you the truth. Who is it?
To be honest, I would probably go with Richard Barleycorn, his cabin boy, because he was his apprentice. And he saw everything. He was on his ship the whole time. So he was on the Adventure Galley and the Antigua. He was on every ship that Captain Kidd had once he sailed from London to New York and then the Indian Ocean. So he would have seen almost everything. He might have been a little young to interpret it. By the time Captain Kidd returned, though, he was close to, I think, 16 or 17. So I think he'd probably be the most reliable eyewitness to everything that happened.
This is a leading question. I understand that, but I'm going to say it. When you look back, you've looked at everything from William Kidd. Was William Kidd, not legally, but just by definition, was he a pirate?
No, I mean, he clearly never embraced the whole idea of being a pirate in the way that maybe a Blackbeard or the later generation of Calico Jack Rackham, Blackbeards, Black Sam Bellamy, they clearly took the ships of all nations. Captain Kidd tried so hard not to commit any piracy, even though he looked away for a Portuguese galleon. But because when he was in the Indian Ocean, once he was in the Indian Ocean for a year, they had 3 different ships under his command, and they weren't around. The other ships weren't around. The November, which was formerly the Ruparel, and the Cadon Merchant, which they changed the name to Adventure Prize, both of those were sailing without Kidd. So Kidd was in the Adventure Galley, his original ship, and those other ships were sailing all over the place. So they were basically pillaging all over the joint. And at his trial, they were really bringing him charges for what those ships were doing. But he was aware of it, the Portuguese galleon, because he did speak with the Portuguese captain. So is looking away piracy? Technically, it might be. And I say that in my book. Technically, manslaughter charge is valid. I mean, it can be, clearly that the mutiny and those conditions really would probably exonerate Kidd generally in that era. But you could make a case that he is, at the end of the day, guilty of either looking the other way for piracy with the Portuguese galleon and manslaughter. So he's not a saint. I don't say he's innocent. What I say is he's not a 100% innocent man. But his whole philosophy and attitude and being a stickler for protocols, even when he was kind of the bucket privateer in the Caribbean, hanging out with a lot of roguish guys, he was still a stickler for a license. He really was. More than virtually any other quote-unquote pirate in the Golden Age, which extended roughly from 1650 to 1730.
I think it's also important to point out, too, when we think about pirate buried treasure, it comes back to Captain Kidd, doesn't it? And of all places, Long freaking Island is where we got some buried pirate treasure, right?
Yes, there's at least $10 billion of pirate treasure out there, and I know exactly where it is because I have a map with an X on it.
I knew it.
Like Indiana Jones, and I know exactly where to go, but I'm not telling anyone, or I'm going to leave a bunch of clues like that, Santa Fe thing that's going on.
Fenn's treasure.
Is that what it is? Yeah. Yes. So Captain Kidd created all of the virtually single-handedly, the buried treasure myths in colonial American history and pirate history. Because when he returned home, the only reason that he put treasure with a bunch of his friends who were leading colonial figures and buried some treasure on Gardiner's Island was because he didn't trust Lord Belmont. So it all comes back to the guy that I want to punch, Lord Belmont. Kidd and his wife, especially Sarah, didn't trust him because he had been in New York and he had already angered everybody because New York and Newport and a lot of these colonial towns and provinces were supported by the Red Sea pirates. I mean, they were getting tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars and bringing it back to American colonies when there were no banks. So this was a huge influx of money. When you only had, a few 100,000 people, in all the colonies, this was a huge thing. And people celebrated when these treasure ships came back. So when Captain Kidd came back, everyone was like, oh my God, Captain Kidd's back. And he's bearing treasure. And it just started, when he started on Gardiner's Island. But he basically just doled out the treasure to Thomas Paine, who was kind of a famous privateer from Newport, Rhode Island area. And Thomas Clark, who was the New York council member and coroner and a privateer captain who helped build Trinity Church. Captain Kidd also helped build Trinity Church in New York City. So he came back and he's giving money because he didn't trust Lord Belmont, who was his sponsor in the Indian Ocean voyage, because he was by then wanted as a pirate. So he distributed it and buried it with a number of people. And that's led to the pirate mythology of, buried treasure.
And then as soon as we stop recording, I'm going to ask you about that map. You're going to send me a picture of it. Do you have time to read nonfiction yourself? And if you do, who are your favorites? Or do you have any nonfiction friends whose books you want to plug? Do you have time for all that?
No, I read what I have to do now is I read everything to do with what I'm currently on or about to do. So I read nonfiction voraciously, everybody, all kinds of authors. Keith Thompson, who plugged my book, he's got Born to be Hanged.
Friend of the pod, he's been on twice before?
Yes, and he was nice enough to give me a blurb for my book. And I loved his book, Born to be Hanged. I've read, Hampton Side's new book on Captain Cook. I read The Wager, David Cron. But there's a number of books, but I really focus on kind of what I'm working on at the time. So in this case, I read Robert Ritchie's book, give him a plug because he was nice enough to blurb my book. He's was the original Captain Kidd scholar. And still, because he wrote Captain Kidd back in 1986, a book on Captain Kidd and the war on pirates. So he used Kidd as more of a proxy on how the Crown began its war on piracy, by the mid-1690s.
Last question for you. Listen, everybody loves pirates, but sometimes they just want to watch pirate movies. They're like nonfiction. Nonfiction's not for me, even if it's about pirates. These poor misguided souls, if I sat one of them in front of you and they're like, Samuel, I'm not necessarily into nonfiction. Why should I read this book? What would you say to them?
My book is written really with a narrative nonfiction style. So it's fast-paced and energetic. It doesn't read that different from my other books that are historical fiction. Technically, Soldiers of Freedom, I wrote about, tankers in World War II. And, I wrote a book on Blackbeard. So all of my books are I stick to history as close as I can because the reason is I'm a scientist. I'm a practicing scientist. So I'm a hydrogeologist in the environmental industry, groundwater modeling, and I do expert witness work. So I'm very much into the scientific method, and I'm very objective and fact-based. So I pack in a lot of detail, too. So it's pretty detailed, and basically every scene is pretty much how I envision it happen. Remember, even history records, with Captain Kidd, there's a lot of unreliable narrators. So Robert Branningham and Joseph Palmer, who lied under oath, it's 100% established, not just by me, but others, that they lied under oath so that Kidd would be hung. They got a full pardon, too, and got away with it. But they lied about a lot. Now, they told the truth on a number of things. But they lied about him being a pirate to get a pardon. So they weren't hung. Kidd had to hang for them. I think that's kind of sums it up right there.
Well, Samuel, I loved it. It's a great book. Thank you for coming on to talk about it. And justice for Captain Kidd.
Yeah, well, or just honesty. I just tried to be objective because remember, at the end of the day, I say technically he committed piracy, the Portuguese galleon, and technically he's guilty of manslaughter. So he wasn't a saint, but he was a good guy who just, was at the wrong place at the worst time to be.
Well, listen, thanks for coming on and talking about it. I'm going to tell everybody to get it.
Thanks a lot, Brendan. It was a great time to be here.
And that's it for this episode. Samuel, thank you so much. Captain Kidd, justice for Captain Kidd. Get this book. You love the pirate stuff. You're going to love this. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.